Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation on creating inclusive public spaces. My name is Matt Eldridge, and I'm a policy program manager in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. I'm joining from New York, and to be on theme for today's conversation, my background is Union Square, one of my favorite active public spaces in the city. We're thrilled you're able to join this webinar, and I'm really excited to hear from three dynamic speakers hailing from Barcelona, Spain, Oakland, California, and Seattle, Washington. Before we start the program, just some quick housekeeping points. Today's event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterward on the event page and on the Urban Institute YouTube channel. A link to biographies for each speaker will be posted in the chat box. We have closed captioning turned on. If you'd like to adjust your settings, simply navigate to the live transcription button on your Zoom screen. All participants are muted, but if you have any questions, you can send them or comments in the Q&A box at any time. And we hope to have enough time for audience Q&A at the end of today's webinar. If you're on Twitter, please join us in tweeting about the event using the hashtag #live@urban. And please complete the short survey at the end of today's event. With that, I'd like to welcome you again to this conversation. This webinar is part of a larger project looking at innovative policies and programs from abroad that can help inform and inspire local policymakers in the United States working to build an inclusive recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. A recovery that addresses historic inequities, builds broad-based growth, and engages and empowers communities and individuals. This project is premised on the belief that good ideas can be borderless, and that while the institutional, legal, economic, and cultural context of the United States is distinct, there are lessons from policies and programs in other countries that can be translated and adapted to help improve social, economic, and environmental outcomes here at home. This project, including today's event, is made possible through generous support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The project centerpiece is 5 short briefs, each focusing on a key policy priority for an inclusive recovery. The briefs include lessons from Australia on childcare financing, a French payroll tax for affordable housing, programs in multiple countries to improve the flow of and access to financing for small businesses and startups, a Welsh program to expand high-speed broadband access, and the focus of today's webinar, Barcelona's superblocks program to expand access to quality public spaces. The link to this project, including these 5 briefs, will be added to the chat box momentarily. It's my pleasure to now introduce the lead author of the public space brief and today's moderator, Kimberly Burroughs. Kimberly is an urban planner by training, a technical assistance manager here at Urban, and an expert on advancing racial equity in parks and public spaces. Kimberly, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Matt, and hello, everyone. As Matt said, my name is Kimberly Burroughs, and I will be moderating today's conversation. We have a really excited panel and presentation planned for you all today. Along with some of the things that Matt mentioned, I'm also a proud community planner, and also on theme with today's conversation, I'll mention that my favorite park is Emancipation Park in Kingston, Jamaica, which is where I'm from. Emancipation Park, like the name suggests, was really developed to commemorate the emancipation and independence in Jamaica. And it's a public space that's located right in the middle of the city and open for everyone. So as Matt mentioned, this event builds off the recent brief that's co-authored by myself and my colleague, Joe Schilling. The brief, titled From Streets to Citizen Spaces, examines how US policymakers can both expand and improve equitable park and green space access in COVID-19 recovery. Now, I know this is a very timely topic and something that we're all thinking about right now. We looked specifically in the brief at Barcelona's superblock model, and we wanted to determine which elements of that model might be translatable to a US context. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker today, Maria Cisternas. Maria is an architect and the co-founder and CEO of Media Urban. She was also the director of urban projects at the Barcelona City Council, and so knows the superblock model very intimately. With that, I pass over to Maria to contextualize how Barcelona developed this use of public space. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's a pleasure. I'm currently not in Barcelona. Yeah, I'm in a little village near Barcelona. I'm working on a project for the environmental recovery of a quarry in a nice vineyard. And it's a pity because 30 minutes before you could see the sunset. But so now I'm in a very rural context. But I will try to go back to my origins. I was born in Barcelona, and as Kimberly mentioned, I worked in the city council, which has developed my passion for urban issues. To frame the discussion, I'm going to try and share my screen. I hope you're seeing it. So to frame the discussion, I have prepared very few slides, promise not to make it very long. But first of all, for you to understand the size of Barcelona and Catalonia. Catalonia is, let's say, the sub country within Spain. That's a controversial issue, the region in Spain currently. And it's built around 4 cities. It's Barcelona, Lleida, Tarragona, and Girona, which and the whole region has 7.7 million inhabitants. I have superimposed the map here in blue for you to understand its size, which would be equivalent to the cities of New York, Philly, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. And if I'm not wrong, those 4 cities account for more or less 11.5 million inhabitants at least. So Barcelona is one of the most visited cities in Europe. It has Catalan culture with Mediterranean tradition. It's a trading nation. It has had a lot of, since it's a maritime area, it has developed its commercial networks on the Mediterranean for centuries. And the industrial activity represents around 20% of the GDP. So it's a very, the industrial economy has a strong size within the country and within Spain also. But also to contextualize and to understand where we are, I've put these 2 images from the same year. The image on the left is from London. It's in 1928. It was the construction of the subway. At that time in Barcelona, Sardà, who was he was an engineer, the engineer that planned the city extension that's called the L'Ensanche, a l'Eixample. And they were building at that time the streets. One of the main innovations of the time was that the developers of the future residential blocks had to pay for the streets and for the services and for the infrastructures that were on those streets. And as you see, the street was the first foundation of the Eixample. And this is to say that we're here. So this is Spain, this is a map of Europe's functional areas. And if you analyze this map, I find it very interesting because it says that both Catalonia and Spain have a lower urban density than other countries in Europe, like Germany, Netherlands, France. Everything that's pointed out in blue is the functional areas, meaning that you have people who are sleeping somewhere and go abroad to work, but that are constantly moving for their job center. And as you see, in our latitudes, we still have more rural and a more landscape, let's say, free landscape between the cities. And I think that's very interesting in that contrast in which cities are really dense, but the landscape and the rural areas are really maintained and built. That also has its externality. But that would be too long for now. This is a picture that I love. It's my favorite public square. It's not exactly in Catalonia, it's in Mallorca, but it's very similar to many squares in Catalan cities. Also the old squares of Barcelona or the squares of Gracia have this size. This is a square in Pollença, which is really simple. It's an excellent quality public space in which, with only those little papers that they put in summer, they qualify and they make you feel inside the public space. Sorry. And that's a complete different city. That's a rural village, also in Catalonia. And these villages have lost their population. Now the country is worried for what will the future be of those enclaves that are far away from infrastructures, far away from the airports. And so it's very difficult to track economic activity. So, sorry about As you know, Barcelona is composed of a central grid. The central grid is not only an invention of Barcelona. Most of the Catalan cities were built upon grids, which were city extensions of the 19th century to accommodate economic and industrial growth. And many of the Catalan cities also share these grids that are, in a way, they follow the ideal of the homogenic city. Also, many of the American cities follow this path as well. I think that puts it very easy to think on a systematic way to address public space. And this is where the idea of the superblocks comes from. Sorry. This is to show the first map of a regional attempting to put some order in terms of the territorial disposition of the uses of the land. And as you see, back in 1930, there was already this conception in which Barcelona would be the capital of Catalonia, but it would be connected to the rest of the city and all the green areas. I think that this was really innovative for the time, was land that had to be preserved from any industrial or urban development. This is a very important map to understand the superblock strategy, and it comes from 1935. It's almost 100 years old. It was written by a team of architects who were called the GATPAC. It was very progressive minds, all men, I have to say, but they worked together to plan the expansion of the city of Barcelona beyond the grid of Cerdà. And as you see, the main arteries of Barcelona, which are La Gran Via, La Diagonal, and La Meridiana, which you see that they have an angle of 45 degrees, and they are really the diagonals of this grid, and how they would extend, and that would allow for the city to connect to a series of metropolitan cities. After the war, what happened is mainly then the civil war started in 36 and it lasted until 39. And then some of these architects were killed, some of them were repressed, some of them had to go to the exile, and those ideas were a little bit lost during the dictatorship of Franco. Going back to 1859, if you see, the first original idea of Cerdà was to create, let's say, like a shape of blocks, urban blocks that had residential plots. They are named, they have letters A, B, C, D, F, G. Each of these would have 3 or 4 floors of residential housing, and inside they would share a big open public space. Now, what happened is that the reality, 100 years later, all these interiors of the block were completely privatized. The city was unable to keep those pieces of land for public uses, and they have been privatized. They are either parkings, or they can be restaurants or shops, ground floor activities that have never addressed what's their contribution, and they have huge potential if we come back to the idea of Cerdà to be planted, to have gardens for communities and for the people who live here. There have been some attempts, so I'll show them later, of the Municipality of Barcelona to really buy these properties, make them be public again, but it's not being easy at all. This is maybe one of the first superblocks. It was, this is l'Hospital de Sant Pau. This is a Nouveau Beaux-Arts architecture, fantastic, from Domènech i Montaner, in which you have 4 urban blocks that are completely pedestrianized. And they're full of pavilions that used to be for sanitary purposes. So that's a hospital. So the city already, the citizens of Barcelona already knew from long ago, because this is a plan of the 20s, how you can walk within 400 meters by 400 meters without seeing a car. I'm gonna skip this one. The superblock strategy cannot be disconnected from the metropolitan transportation policy. As in many cities, and preparing this session yesterday, we shared this experience as well. We have lots of metropolitan dwellers that come to Barcelona daily to work. So, as I said yesterday, many of the Barcelona residents walk and bike to their jobs, but it's really difficult. And let's say many city residents already don't use the car because the city is very dense. Things are very nearby. The distances are not long. But in terms of the metropolitan transportation, it's difficult to get all those people who don't have this level of accessibility in terms of public transport to let them out of the car. And one of the main problems the city has is what we have to do with all these metropolitan dwellers that also have a right to access the city. Now, the superblock strategy has also learned from your experience in New York, which was, I think, very cleverly and brilliantly ideated by Gale architects. You know, it was this idea that when people see with a scenery, with a certain theater, that they can use the space for other purposes than going by car, then they feel that the change is possible. So that's exactly what the city of Barcelona did, using the pandemics, this idea of the super blocks and of cutting some of the streets to allow for more pedestrian areas, and in a way to cut the transit inside the Eixample. During the pandemic, the city council decided to make a proof, and they painted, as you painted in Broadway, the street, the area gained to the street. Now, this in a city in Barcelona, we are very confident of design. Design matters a lot, and not all the designs were very clear. The colors were very this yellow and this blues, and sometimes the iconics of the transformation was really different. It was like the strategies of the beast. It was this is an emergency, and you've got to get out of the streets. And this raised a lot of polemics. So now the city understood the reaction, and to make it more comfortable, to design it in a way that people really feel that the pacification of the streets will look like a normal street. They did this competition in which you see the final design. They're now doing the projects to build the final question, to build the final version of it by the end of in 2 years' time. And finally, I know I'm probably out of time. I want to end my presentation sharing one of these operations in which the city council acquired private land in the city, within one of the urban blocks, This is near Passeig San Juan. And as you can see, the space was arranged so that people can go through, and that new green areas and also new spaces and playgrounds emerged. And I think that this has also a brilliant capacity to bring and pacify the city, because when you're inside these blocks, you really don't hear a car, and to give the citizens of Barcelona a much more pedestrian version of the city. So I will end up my presentation here and give the floor to somebody else.
Great, thank you so much, Maria. Your presentation was really able to contextualize, especially visually, what the superblock looks like, and also that transition that we went through. I was particularly interested when you mentioned that there were these types of urban designs and structures that existed before, but they were more privatized. And there was this intentional, and I think intention is a very important word here, because it seemed as if the local government had this intention to democratize the space and really ensure that you're transforming neighborhoods in a way that will impact the lives of all citizens, especially those that were previously marginalized and were not able to utilize the space. Now, I just wanted to mention that the exact program that's being implemented in Barcelona may not work in every city, but there are elements and lessons that can inform these efforts in other places. In the brief that Joshua and I co-authored, we highlighted several of these innovative elements, and we also tried to translate some relevant lessons for local US policymakers. But then when we think about the context of American cities and American communities, what do some of these concepts that Maria spoke about in Barcelona actually look like? I want to raise some questions. What considerations should local policymakers keep in mind when they're trying to do this work? And if we truly want to encourage public space investment that is equitable, how can we do so as communities recover from the COVID-19 pandemic? Now, I know I left you with a lot of food for thought, so get excited, because we are lucky enough today to be joined by two excellent panelists who will be discussing some of these points and offering reflections based on their experiences in US cities. So joining Maria on the panel, we will have Sam Zimbabwe, who is the director of the Seattle Department of Transportation, and Jay Nicholas Williams, who's the director of the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Youth Development in Oakland, California. Sam, Nicholas, welcome to the floor.
Thank you. We're delighted to be here today. Greetings to all.
Great to see everybody.
Awesome. And as I mentioned before, it's really great that we have this conversation with folks spread all over different coasts, different countries. I think this is truly a delight that we can all come together to talk about this, and also being able to frame the conversation around these very stark images that Maria posed before. Now, one of the key things that I picked up from the presentation was really thinking about scale and translatability. And this is a key point that we also raised in the report. Now, at the core, the goal of the superblock model is to really recalibrate the use of current transportation infrastructure, so the streets and the way that we think about streets, and create these new types of public spaces that both promote and protect the pedestrian. So we're thinking about pedestrian first design here. In Maria's presentation, she talks about being able to achieve this at the citywide scale in Barcelona. And also in Barcelona, they'd like to develop 500 of these similar superblocks by 2030. That is just around the corner. Now, many might think that there are very few American cities that have these wide streets, large and distinct grid patterns, the low density neighborhoods, all of these characteristics that Barcelona had working for them. And so I want to turn over to Sam first. I know that you oversee green transformation projects in Seattle. For example, the Stay Healthy Streets, it's a prominent initiative of yours, and many of these are happening at the neighborhood level. So I want to ask, how can streets be reprioritized at different scales, city and community scales? And what are the implications when models for pedestrianizing streets are adapted to a more localized context?
Yeah, so again, really excited to be here and talking about these issues and learning from both Maria's examples and what Nicholas is doing in Oakland as well. Here in Seattle, when the pandemic struck last spring of 2020, we very quickly moved to create more space for people to get out of their houses and get around their communities. There was a time when we were asking people to only take essential trips. We were asking people to actually only take transit if they needed to take essential trips, and also trying to decongest some of our parks and open spaces and give people more space. So we very quickly converted about 20 miles of our neighborhood greenways. And these are community streets that have some crossing upgrades at arterial streets or have some traffic calming elements, but we're still sort of open for all vehicles. And we quickly turned those into, we closed them for cars for through traffic, but still left everybody who had access already able to have access and open them up for people. We then expanded that program to include some streets next to our most popular parks. And then as we started into recovery, thinking about how we could reuse our streets for commercial activities and dining and merchandise and things like that too. These have been popular, but we have had some challenges as we've gone to implement them on a more permanent basis, which I'm happy to get into. I think some of the questions later on will get into some of those challenges that we faced and how we've addressed them. But it was really important for us to take this at a healthy scale, starting with 20 miles. We're now over 25 miles of these stay healthy streets, building on previous investment in these neighborhood greenways. And then think about how we adapt and evolve those programs over time as we head into broader recovery overall.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. And that's such a great example as we're thinking about this recovery model. So I think, we're really thinking about physical spaces as being at the apex of us being able to connect with communities and to come outside and to really build back the social fabric of the communities that we live and work in. And that's another piece of the superblock model that Maria spoke to, this idea that it's beyond just physical, it's also social connections. In the brief, we do highlight the role of parks and public spaces in promoting a sense of connection among people. And we know that public space can really cultivate this sense of belonging and community among diverse populations, especially when they live or work in a particular area. But at the same time, I came across some surveys recently that show that a third of Americans do not talk to their neighbors, which I find very disheartening. There's such a critical role that these spaces can play in removing social segregation and building trust and get people outside to talk to each other. But at the same time, we do know things like social cohesion, social capital, those are very important, but incredibly challenging to both communicate and to connect to policy decisions. I'm sure both of you in local government have faced that. I want to turn over to you next, Nicholas. I know last year, Oakland had released a park equity survey that led to several recommendations. And one of the recommendations that caught my eye was complete neighborhoods with strong neighborhood parks and authentic belonging. Now I'm curious, what does it mean to promote authentic belonging in the park and green space? And how do you know when you've actually achieved this goal?
Hey, Kim, that's a great question, and thank you for having me today. Authentic belonging means that people feel safe, they feel included, and they feel a part of what's happening. Parks and recreation and green space have historically been places that families get together, that kids get together from different neighborhoods, that people come together and hang out and socialize and talk. And celebrate their differences and be in community. Oftentimes, as we create these parks, we're not actually asking the question, the most critical question to ask is, who is this for? Who is this for? Who is invited to this space? And it seems like a simple question, but if you ask the question and you don't get a good answer, or you don't understand that you have included all the different communities who make up our larger community. Oakland has over 137 languages that are spoken here in the city. So how could we create spaces where everyone can come and speak their own language? Everyone can come and share their language with other people and still be in community. right now America is faced with so many different issues that pulls us apart and pulls us into different areas. And historically, parks and green spaces and public spaces have been places where people can come together and talk respectfully, and the kids can learn from each other and create these opportunities to be in community. So if our parks aren't doing that, we have to stop and ask the critical question, who is this space for?
Because I think that's such a great question. We should have named the brief that, who is this space for? Because we know that in the past, these types of public spaces, parks, green spaces, they just have not been open for everyone. We know that these were spaces where legacies of segregation, slavery, racial violence, redlining, any other forms of systemic oppression have really barred people from even wanting to connect in this area. And I know specifically in the US, it's barred several people of color, particularly Black Americans, and not really created that sense of welcoming and belonging and safety. I think safety is such a critical piece in when we're talking about accessing quality parks. So I want to move from the who is a public space for to the how can we make public space for everyone? How can we advance racial equity in public space? And I want to ask this question of everyone on the panel, which is how can governments work with communities, alongside communities, to build public spaces that are both inclusive and can start to address some of these inequities that we've seen historically? And I want to start with Maria talking a little bit about inclusion in Barcelona, and then we'll move back over to the US and would love to hear some remarks from both Sam and Nicholas. So Maria, over to you first.
So I think in Barcelona, the inclusion traditionally has been, let's say, designing open spaces for all and expecting that since the city is very dense and since the city has a historical background in which you have those Arabic Medinas and those organic streets, people really have no choice. They have to gather. Like La Rambla is the place where you cannot skip going through La Rambla. But I think that there is a lot of, we still need to think about inclusion in a wider way. Like we know our population has changed in the last 20 years, and maybe the tools we had from the past have not evolved as much as the society has. We keep designing spaces thinking that only with design we will include these people. So in my view, there are three key issues. Affordability, making sure that spaces are affordable and that everyone can open a little shop, open a little service like hairdresser, or even the most affluent neighborhoods, as the Eixample is, because the Eixample is the most affluent and the most gentrified neighborhood of Barcelona. Still, this neighborhood needs economies and diversity and all sorts of ranges and population. So affordability would be key. Secondly, public transport. I think even for those people, it's not true that the Eixample or the superblocks will only be useful for the citizens of the Eixample. They will be used by anyone as long as they can use it and they have access to that place. And finally, I think it's also a change of mind from us, from policymakers. I often hear policymakers justifying their decisions in front of community planning, instead of modifying their own ideas. No? It looks as if you doubt, you're an ignorant. And I think it's the opposite. If you're able to listen, change your own prejudices, then you can put your knowledge at the service of people who are really the experts because they are really living there. So this would be my 3 points.
Yeah, those are great. I especially like that last one on the culture shift. Curious to hear, Sam, if you want to go ahead and tackle that question, add to the list, or feel free to embrace some of those that Maria's included.
Yeah, I would embrace all of what Maria said. In our context too, we've had to be sure that we're listening. And so often when we go and work with communities, we as the public sector have a project that we've already defined, or we've already decided, here's a project, we're coming to deliver it for you. And then when somebody says, wait a second, we've got maybe other problems, or we have other needs that are not being met by this project, we sort of get stuck. And so I think it's important to engage with communities about what they need, what people in the community need, and be able to be adaptable and change. When we first started our Stay Healthy Streets, we got concerns from some communities, particularly Black communities that had been the focus of redlining in the past in Seattle and had a lot of inequities already sort of built in, and were getting disparately impacted by the pandemic and by the economic fallout. And in those communities, when we came and put signs that said street closed, even though we really meant street open for everybody, but the sign had to say street closed, it created a tension between neighbors where there was gentrification happening, and now people were being asked, why are you here? Why are you on this street, by somebody walking on the street? And there was a legitimate reason why somebody was driving to their house or to their family's house because they may have been displaced farther. So if we only come with the solution and don't engage with communities about the problems, we're going to miss, or we might increase some of those tensions rather than bringing people together as the intention should be.
I think that's absolutely right, because then we're thinking right now about the street hierarchy, and going back to Nicholas's question, who is public space for? Who is the street for? You know, is the street for cars? Is it for people, pedestrians? And I think that's really the question that we're interrogating here. Nicholas, want to add anything?
Absolutely. Maria and both Sam hit it right on the head. I'll just add two things. One thing is access. When we talk about the equitable distribution of resources, that informs us that we can't put a swimming pool or a high, a big amenity in every community, right? And so oftentimes when we place these amenities in a community, we haven't necessarily thought about access. Obviously it's placed here, but are there transportation routes that get people from other parts of town to this amenity? Or is this amenity placed where then it becomes like a special amenity for a special part of town? That's one thing. The other piece is that, like Sam talked about, oftentimes we're not listening as well as we should. For instance, like Sam alluded to, we have this plan that we're trying to put into a community, but we don't listen to the needs of the community before we implement the plan. And again, it seems really simple. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of with transportation is bicycle lanes, and it creates opportunities, right? There's opportunities for people to use these lanes to get to other parts of town. It's less emissions, it's healthier, it's safer. But we're putting the bicycle lanes in communities where the kids don't have bicycles. And so it's, again, who is this for? We have to answer the question, who is this for? And so this is a simple fix. You come in the community, you talk about the wonderful aspects of having these bicycle travel lanes, you talk about the benefits, and then you ask the question, how can we help? What assistance can we provide to create opportunities for you to use or be able to use this new amenity? And then it answers the question who it's for. It's for us, and it also creates opportunities for others to use this and to use this new amenity. And so access, and then also opportunity to make sure that when we're coming into neighborhoods that we're actually listening and say, hey, what are the needs here? How can we help to educate you and bring you along, but also what are the immediate needs so that we can help this community with its disparities at this particular moment.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's just so stark to think about putting bike lanes in the community where, the kids don't have bikes. They're not going to be utilizing this asset that, seemingly feels so important. It's the ways in which we want to shape our streets, but we're shaping it in a way that still doesn't relate. And I want to push a little bit further. We're talking here about community engagement, participatory processes, and I, for one, think that it's just incredibly important for government to also be embracing these types of strategies and approaches. And so I would love, Sam and Nicholas, if you could share an example of, when we're talking about community engagement, could you share an example of where there was a community engaged strategy that you may have done before, whether it's a public meeting or some type of design charrette? And I'm going to start with you, Nicholas. I see you nodding your head, so I think an example has popped to your mind. And then we'll go over to Sam in Seattle.
We're currently going through a rebuild with one of our recreation centers. Unfortunately, about 2.5 years ago, it was burned down due to a homeless encampment at the park. And so we're currently going through a rebuild. And what we realized is that the more people that we invited to the table, not only were we getting more ideas about how we can reshape this park, but there was more funding coming in. There was more resources coming in. Hey, if you include us, we'd love to have a little reading corner in the part of the park in the amphitheater, and we can help to raise money for that. Hey, if you include us, I know you're going to build a gym, but if you can build it to high school regulation style, then some of the schools can use it for their games, and then you're bringing people into the community. You're creating this different, more access points. Hey, we're thinking about building a pool. So why not make it a therapeutic pool and make it a healing pool? There's a hospital across the street, and obviously there's more opportunities for funding and fundraising. And so oftentimes we feel like if we include too many people, the ideas get too big, or it's hard for us to narrow down, our focus. But we found that the more people we include, we actually find more opportunities to move forward and to accomplish our goals.
That's a really great example. Sam?
Yeah, and I think the last few years of the pandemic have been challenging in terms of community engagement, and have pushed us into new ways to do that work. Traditionally, I think we would have the big public meeting, we'd present something or have an open house. We've been able to use some different strategies, including online meetings, including in-person sort of intercept survey type of things, or community walks where we get people together in a safe outdoor environment and talk about issues together in smaller groups. I think finding those ways to get feedback and really get deep engagement and help people talk to each other too. So much of our community engagement processes have been sort of talking to the government rather than talking to each other, and that puts us in a challenging place in terms of balancing some of these sometimes competing needs within a community and finding the ways forward. I think we find that different groups are able to participate in different ways. And so if you only do things in a certain way, if you only do a public meeting, if you only do an online meeting, if you only do a small group walk, you end up getting a narrow slice of what the full diversity of a community thinks. And so you really need to find ways to push yourself and do a whole bunch of different methods, and then try to synthesize that back and make a plan to move forward without getting lost in the process, so that you can't make decisions and move forward. Eventually, you've got to make a decision and try to figure out how to go forward.
Mm-hmm. And Sam, I think you're really articulating what one of the key challenges is of government's role in this, is that a decision has to be made with the public dollars, but how do you do it in partnership with the community? And earlier you had mentioned, that big G word, gentrification. And I want to make sure that, we work that into the conversation here, because I think, when we do have these opportunities to have a participatory process and really engage the community in meaningful ways, sometimes community members just don't show up because they'll say, well, that over there is not for me. This improvement of public space, I'm fearful because I'm going to get priced out. We're going to see property values raise, and studies have shown that when there's a newer improved park or green space, property values can go up between 8 to 10%. So as a local resident, I could definitely imagine where you're fearful that this is a community that's not just changing in terms of identity, but either your home or your small business is not going to be able to ride the financial wave of being able to stay even beyond the change of those assets, even though the asset is going to benefit you. So I want to go back over to Barcelona, and Maria, I just wanted to ask, was this potential rise in land value a concern in Barcelona as you're implementing the superblocks? I know you spoke a little bit about affordability earlier. So if that was a concern, were there any steps that you all had to take to ensure that the residents that were living in these regions of superblocks could continue to afford living there?
I love the question of gentrification of L'Eixample, because it's the reason why my mom, who lived I lived in L'Eixample, and she rented an apartment, and suddenly with the phenomenon of touristic apartments and Airbnb, the owner was not interested in her rent anymore, and she could not continue. She wouldn't get her contract renewed. So I have lived what the gentrification in Eixample is, and mainly it was due to tourism. That's another issue. To me, because of course that's a planning discussion that I always have in Barcelona, which is that we consider a touristic apartment as a residential use, and I think it's not a residential use; it's an economic activity, and we have lots of difficulties to address this issue. To me, the investment in public space should never evict people. That's the uses of the residential properties that you're using. What the city is trying to do is trying to buy properties in affluent neighborhoods to build, to refurbish them as affordable homes. So if they own it, the city can create a larger, we call it park of social housing. I don't know the name in English. So to me, the only way to control that right now is building properties and having a significant amount of residences that are at affordable prices. There, at some point, somebody suggested, it has never been implemented, but when that there should be a mechanism to recapture the value of what the public sector has invested. This has never been applied. It's written, so from the law you could actually ask the property owners, especially those that own properties in ground floor spaces like commerces, that are directly influenced by the public investment in the street, in a way to recap. One way to do this would be that of course, all the property owners can stay, but if they sell the property, then the let's say the valuation, the higher valuation of the property, that could go back in part to the city council to refinance the public works. But to be honest, this has not been addressed yet. It's on the air, and hopefully I can learn from my colleagues here.
Yeah, I think this is really the big question. How are you able to mitigate against these potential consequences of something like gentrification? You don't want to not change a place and offer the opportunity for quality access if it's something that's really going to benefit the folks that live there. And so, Sam, I want to turn to you first, and then we'll go over to Nicholas. Are there any lessons that you have for other cities as you're thinking about mitigating these consequences?
I'm not sure that I do. I have some thoughts. I'm not sure I have any lessons to teach folks at this point. What we are working on is what we call a transportation equity framework, and thinking with an external group of stakeholders that have not been traditional transportation stakeholders, but are community-based organizations and representing sort of a broad diversity of viewpoints on how we build equitable cities. And they've really pushed us to think beyond the silo of transportation and what our transportation investments might be, to think about the other aspects that transportation influences and needs to consider as we think about transportation equity. And so those are, economic development and housing affordability and community safety, sort of a holistic view of community safety, which causes us to think about how our transportation investments can be paired with some other interventions, like what Maria was talking about, to build or reinforce community wealth or community stability at the same time as we are making some of these investments. Now, I talked about our Greenway network as being the baseline for our Stay Healthy Streets. That Greenway network is 45 miles and growing as we work across the city to connect communities. And these are like, people call them different things in different places: bicycle boulevards, neighborhood streets, sort of different types of things. But they're places where we've done some community engagement, talked about what's important in a community and what we want to be connecting, and then found, slow, flat, relatively calm traffic routes overall, and made those safer and more accessible for people. So we've already had some engagement in many communities, and then we're layering on top of that sort of a more pedestrian first streets, sort of upgrading that even further. But I'd go back again to sort of meeting communities with what they need. So often our communities that are that have seen disinvestment or underinvestment from the public sector in the past, when we start to do a project, if we haven't talked with the community, or if we are coming to do something new that doesn't feel useful, it feels, I think you said it, Kimberly, like it feels alienating. It feels like it's not for the community itself. And so we've even started with just trying to come and fix the things that are already broken, fix the sidewalks, put the signs back the way they should be. You know, do we do a lot of curb ramp reconstruction, just come in sort of the basics, the things that you would expect in a community, but some of these communities have overlooked. Once we've done that, and once we've shown that we can deliver on the basic services, then we can start to have the conversation about what comes next, what connections are missing for people, what we might be able to offer from the city that can help address problems. And with that, we can also come with some of our own transformational ideas about how to make a city safer and more accessible, less car dependent, and things like that. And then we have to be able to listen. We have to listen to, the transit services doesn't work for me. The bike lane doesn't get me someplace. I don't have the bikes that are needed, or, so many different things that communities are struggling with that we can help deliver if we're not solely focused on what the project is that we're trying to deliver.
I really like that sentiment, that approach that you just mentioned, Sam, of fix what's broken first. I don't think, we often think about the quick wins in that way. We think about the big hairy beast of here are all the challenges that are going to pop up. And so I really like that perspective that you're offering. And so I want to go over to Nicholas. Is there anything in Oakland that you can share in terms of being able to ensure that the people that the investments were really for can also receive those benefits?
Absolutely. And Sam started out by saying he didn't have much to share, and then he just dropped this brilliant nugget. That was fantastic. That was great. I'll try that one day. I'll piggyback off something he said. He said, fix what's broken. What we've done in Oakland, we've tried to automate some services that create disparities. For instance, there are some streetlights in some particular parts of town that if it gets dark and that street light is out by 8 p.m., somebody's going to call. They're going to use their influence and power. They're going to call the council member. They're going to call the mayor. They're going to call the public works. There'll be a truck out there and they'll fix that light within a 3 or 4 hour window. There are some lights that have been out on the other side of town for 20 years. And the expectation is just that the light doesn't come on. What government can do and what cities can do is just, we know that light has a 5-year lifespan. At 4 years and 11 months, I'm sending somebody out there automatically to replace that light bulb so that these lights are always on. And so I think these are small things that government can do to be intentional about at least not creating disparities in services that the city is paying for and that the taxpayers deserve. So Sam, that was brilliant. Maria, that was your presentation was brilliant too. I've learned so much from being here today.
Great. Yes, I'm just loving how everyone is building on each other's answers, because I think we're really trying to paint a picture here that this is not easy, but it's something that we intentionally want to do. And it's going to take so much of a thoughtful process and approach just to ensure that we get there in partnerships. And I also want to just remind the audience that the Q&A box is open. We are going to reserve about 10 minutes at the end of our Q&A, our panel discussion, so that you all can chime in and offer some questions for our wonderful panel that we have here today. So just wanted to pick up on what Nicholas had just mentioned about partnerships and really being able to facilitate and foster that conversation with the community. Now, what we're talking about here, none of this is cheap or free or easy. We are talking about something that will take funding, it will take capacity. And we know that in the parks and public space, there is limited funding, and there are competing priorities for the limited resources that even exist right now in this space. Now, right now, what we're hearing from our speakers, as well as just examples all around the country, there is just a tremendous amount of momentum, especially in the pandemic right now. We're seeing at the local level that there are changes happening with how we think about streets, the places that we connect, and how we get people out of their homes in a socially distanced way where they can still speak to each other and engage in their environment. So just this week, I'm sure everyone saw that there was a signing of the infrastructure bill, and that provides a whole new level of federal funds that could be used for these types of interventions. So that, in addition to the American Rescue Plan Act funds, as well as the potential Build Back Better bill, could offer and unlock additional opportunities for federal dollars. So I want to go over to you, Maria, first. Could you talk a little bit about the more critical partnerships that the local government had to make to advance the superblock expansion in Barcelona, and how you thought more about funding?
Well, first of all, I have to say, I believe that every pound spent for real in a street is a real economy, it's something tangible. It's not online, it's not blockchain, it's accountable, people can touch it. I also think that Barcelona is an exceptional city because it's a very rich city, and in which the city mayor has a lot of power. Some people say the city mayor of Barcelona has more power than the president of Spain or the president of Catalonia. It's also the public opinion is exposed constantly to what the city, and this has been long, not for this mayor, but for especially it began with Maragall 20 years ago. On the other hand, so I think the strong point in Barcelona is that the city council invests money in public space, and that has made the city what it is, because Barcelona doesn't have huge multinationals, it doesn't have a monarchy, so it doesn't have rich properties, it doesn't have the aristocracy or the national services as Madrid has. It's an industrial city built upon public money invested in the streets, so that the quality of public space raises in time. What the city doesn't do very well is to let's say pull the private sector to follow those public investments. So I think what the next step for the superblocks would be to align the public investment with companies, with property owners, companies wanting to create new services, shared vehicles, electric bikes. There's lots of entrepreneurs, innovative companies wanting to serve better citizens, and they don't know how to do it. Like, they create in their laboratories a lot of gadgets, but I think the city is the perfect definer of how they can serve better citizens. So in that sense, I think it's about believing in the city leadership. I would end up here. But I'm all open to my American colleagues, in which you are much more able to us to build interesting public-private partnerships.
Thank you, Maria. And I think, that point is just, I would triple underscore it, the importance of partnerships and thinking about the unusual suspects in those partnerships. Oftentimes there's challenges in trying to engage the business community and entrepreneurs, especially because it's usually a one-person shop. And I think, being able to bring them into that conversation is really important, especially as we're thinking about collaborating around funding. So yes, I want to hop over to Nicholas and Sam and acknowledge that we all here, we're the coalition of the willing. We already bought into the value of these public spaces. But how can we influence local, state, and national policy decisions, especially with the amount of funding we've seen being made available? And how can we target that funding towards these types of causes and fostering these partnerships that we're talking about here? And I'm going to go over to you first, Nicholas, and then Sam.
It's time for us to lift the story and how much that parks and green space and public spaces make up for our health, both physical health and our mental health. It's time to lift our stories about how our communities need to heal together. It's time for us to lift our stories about the value of parks and the jobs that we create and the economic opportunities that we create I was at the National Parks and Recreation Association convening in Nashville in September, and parks and green space generate over $2 billion worth of economy and jobs for Americans. And it's time for us to lift that up. But at the same time, it's time for us to create this advocacy that these are public spaces available and open for everyone. And there's so many benefits to these spaces, and that a small amount of investment from both public and private entities comes together to make transformational changes in our neighborhoods, both at the local level and regionally. And so it's just time for us to lift our story, and not just from a social impact story, but from using scientific data to prove that the impact of parks and recreation, the impact of parks and green space and public spaces and publicly accessible spaces that are fully inclusive are at the very core and at the very knit of the American society. And it's time for us to make that more important.
Nicholas, I think you're absolutely right here. And as a park advocate myself, that is a soapbox that I typically stand on and say, we need to really demonstrate the value here. I mean, we know it, and we need to find a way to pull others in so that we can continue to finance these super important assets. Sam, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. I just go back to some of the new funding sources that have come through the pandemic recovery, and those have been really important for us as we think about how to build some of these new pieces of infrastructure. A lot of the local funds were really strained, especially last year into this year. The recovery has been slow, and so that federal relief was critical. The American Rescue Plan, now the infrastructure plan, are really critical for us to move some of these overall investments in our transportation system forward. In terms of other partnerships too, beyond sort of the upfront cost, there is an ongoing operations cost to making a lot of great public spaces. And what unfortunately that drives us to quite often is to places that already have some of those resources in place. The business improvement district type of resources, which leaves behind some of our commercial areas or some of our businesses or communities. Those are critical partnerships that are vital for making places successful. But if we only can partner with places that have already sort of come together around a business improvement type of a model, we're going to leave some places behind. We made our street permits like sidewalk cafe, taking over parking lanes, things like that, free during the pandemic. We called it our Safe Starts permits. But we found that a lot of the sort of getting into places that might have immigrant or refugee run businesses, or where there was a language barrier, even though it was free, people didn't know how to take advantage of those services. And so making sure that we're translating materials, spending our outreach time in some places where we might not otherwise be able to build those partnerships because of language barriers, because of things like that, is really critical for making sure we can spread the benefits throughout our city.
Absolutely right. I 100% agree. And I think that is something that we really need to think about, because at the local level, we are constrained for funds. So how can we be a little bit broader in how we're thinking about this holistic pie of public space and what it really encompasses? I'm seeing a few questions pop up from the Q&A box, and I'm gonna just pick from a few of these. So this person here is mentioning that we're really talking about community engagement and how important that is in the public space. But is the existence of the public space, so when you build a park or you have an open green space, is that enough? Or do we need to be thinking about programming as well? How do we think about operations and maintenance? So this person is asking here, do we need an operational entity or a process to ensure that public space doesn't fall into divisive use? And I want to go over to Nicholas first. And Maria, I'd also love for you to dive in to talk a little bit about how Barcelona has thought about utilizing space.
I think that's a fantastic question. And no, I don't think it's enough to just build the space. I think if the space is going to be safe, if the space is going to be usable, if the space is going to be inclusive, then I think that we would always be on some type of community engagement that just doesn't end after a year or after 2 years, that we would always be engaged with the community to make sure that we are maintaining the space the right way, to make sure that the space is being used collectively and fully inclusively, to make sure that the space is safe, and to continuously do assessments of the space to make sure that it is reaching the intended outcomes, and that the intended recipients of the amenities feel that it is very yet still an amenity. So I don't think the community engagement is a one-time or a once a year type of thing. I think the best spaces are always continuously asking the question, are we doing the right thing here? And is this space being utilized to the best of its ability?
Nicholas, absolutely right. It's more than just the bricks and the mortar. It's also the programming. Maria, could you speak a little bit to how the superblocks were programmed, or the different ways in which you all thought about programming the superblocks?
My experience with roads transformation, with streets transformation, is that there is a critical moment, which is after the public works, because works typically close the space for 2 years, maybe 3 years. Citizens are fed up. Every time they cross that space, they think of you, your family, and they literally want to kill you. So I think, and then we have lots of shops closed, and we have lots of restaurants affected. So we have to admit that our work as planners affects the daily life of many people for years. A public work is really serious, right? So my point is, when we transform La Diagonal is this street that crosses Barcelona, is our Broadway. La Diagonal has always, for 10 years at least, every mayor has wanted to pacify it because it's not needed. No, you have the horizontal and the vertical street, so you could completely pacify La Diagonal. But the citizens have La Diagonal, and especially car drivers, not the citizens, car drivers want to use La Diagonal every time because it was their shortcut. While I was in office, one of my projects was to pacify 4 lanes of La Diagonal. It was a 10-lane street, and we pacified 4. We let 6 for the next step, right? And I was super worried. And what we did was that after the public works, we programmed activities by counting on the experience of disadvantaged communities that are super expert in driving nice amenities for children. We programmed activities for children. And honestly, I almost cried the day I saw the Diagonal closed. It was so full of people. And only with the programming of 4 weekends, we completely changed the mentality of La Diagonal. Every time I read a newspaper, I thought we were the worst profession ever, that policy makers in the city had become crazy because the papers were always outlining the bad effects of the public works. But that transformation and the celebration of people going back, using the sidewalks, children having fun, I think it reconciled the citizenship with the city, and we deserve it, right? It costs so much to bring machinery, public works, new stones, and the cost of programming is so little that you can really afford it. And it's employed with people that are in a way engaging with the city. So I think it's key. It's a very good mechanism to transform the public space.
Great point. Being able to program and engage people in that public space is just so important. And another question that's coming in here is talking about the fact that, we're talking with the superblocks about something that's decently large. But even when we do the small temporary pilots, the temporary bike lanes, the temporary bus lanes, things like that, it can still be contentious. And so, Sam, I know that you've had this experience of closing off streets in Seattle. So would love for you to share some tips or recommendations for how do you design some of these smaller scale pilots in ways that still push the envelope?
Yeah, so I think that you have to be willing to try some things, and in some, try the right things in some ways too, right? You don't want to bite off more than you can chew. You don't want to promise things that you can't deliver, because I think that can spoil some of the future possibilities. So we didn't say we're going to close off every street. We said we're going to build on this existing system of neighborhood greenways, and we're going to upgrade them as the first point, and show that it's possible. When we also listened a lot, when we closed some of the streets near parks, we started to hear from community members that they were having trouble accessing the parks in general. And so we had to adjust those plans. We opened back up parking lots and access to parking lots because it was important for people who didn't live right there and people who had disabilities or things like that. So being able to be adaptable and not be so fixed that you can't hear feedback and change. But really also then having the confidence that, yeah, we're going to try this. We're going to, work through some of those initial pieces of negative feedback or make the adjustments that we need to make, and really try to, demonstrate that this is something possible as we continue to evolve.
Definitely hearing their proof of concept. That is something that is just so critical, and not doing too much.
And then I think being ready to take it to scale. Once you've shown that concept, sort of figuring out what your pipeline is, right? We've tried this, it was successful, or here's what we're changing. And then now we're going to take that to scale. So it's something that we can do on a more regular basis, sort of what, like what Maria has talked about too.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, our examination of the superblock model, all superblocks did not get rolled out overnight. They started very small, tried to get some community input, and then from there built out, because not every community was actually right for a superblock model. There's another question here in the chat, which is all about the money. I really enjoy those because I think it's important. We're talking about funding these, really fantastic projects. And this is a question for Sam and Nicholas, which is, are there any grants available for municipalities and municipal agencies for technical assistance that supports communities that don't have business improvement districts? Or perhaps anything that's available for community organizations? I know that this can be a little bit of a tricky question, because sometimes you have to be scouring to find what the right fit is when you see some of these types of technical assistance offerings. So I'm going to start with you, Nicholas, and then over to Sam, if you have any thoughts on what's available.
That's a great question. I'll have to use Sam here and say, I don't have much to say here. I would just say, like you said, Kim, look through all of the available resources. Oakland does have a small business grant office with a lot of grants available. And then, you're just going to have to be creative. Check with the community economic associations, maybe the Commerce of Chambers and other associations, maybe Rotary or something like that, to see where those grants exist. But it's going to vary from city to city, from town to town, for sure.
Sam, anything to add?
It's there. There's all sorts of places to look. I think there's also community groups that may be ready to partner, may need some resources to be able to partner, but may not need all of the infrastructure. And they may be in places that you don't always expect, that are sort of willing to take on that partnership around management of public spaces or things like that. We have been able, there was a grant through the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, working with Bloomberg on some small scale interventions. We used that with a community group, and then commissioned an artist to do a street mural that then was combined with some traffic calming that really addressed some concerns in the community about traffic safety, brought the community together around the artwork that the artist did, and brought the city closer, because we had worked in partnership with this community group on accomplishing this project. And then we have a better relationship with that community group going forward, and sort of what comes next in that partnership. So that was a small grant, $50,000, but being able to find the small things that then can build into larger partnerships, I think is a good way to start.
That's a great point. And even at Urban, we do technical assistance, and I would encourage anyone that's looking for technical assistance or that type of financing to look at your community foundations. You could even look at some of the national or regional foundations in the US to see if there are any opportunities there. Now, we unpacked a whole lot of material today. We spoke about gentrification, we spoke about equity, we spoke about urban design. And so I'm going to take moderator's privilege by asking the last question, just really recognizing that this is a journey, and it can be a very long journey for localities. And public space investment is something that's so critical but can be tedious. For all of you, what gives you hope in the future of equitable public space? Why do you still engage in this work, and what's exciting? And is there one clear action that localities can do to keep advancing this work? If you had to say one thing, what would it be? And I'll start with you, Maria.
I think my passion for doing my job, which I love, is to keep learning. Like, I believe my walking in the city is my source of inspiration, of learning. I'm constantly learning from observing other people. And well, it's a luxury to have a job in which I don't have to go to a strange laboratory, put a strange helmet on me. I think as policymakers have to be very observative, and as we learn, we can expect that also municipalities can learn and can innovate. So there's a lot that they can do. I cannot think of one only thing.
Great, thanks, Maria. Sam?
Sure. Well, so what gives me hope in this is that, you know, I'm representing the work that we've done at SDOT, but there are so many people within this organization that have contributed to all of these ideas. And so it's really when we all looked last year and said, what can we do in terms of helping a community stay safe and then recover? And the ideas came from everywhere. The ideas were throughout this organization of about 1,100 people, and everybody's good ideas we were able to put into practice. And so that those ideas are out there and just need to be sort of fertilized and brought forward gives me lots of hope as we think about the creative solutions, because it's never going to be, you know, the person sitting in my chair who knows everything about every community, but our willingness to partner and find those solutions throughout our organization gives me a lot of optimism for where we can go. Great.
And Nicholas, can you close us out?
Absolutely. I'll just piggyback on that word hope. We're hopeful that we get back to the place where our public spaces and our green spaces are fully inclusive and in places where people come to learn about their neighbors and to make new friends and to grill outside and to catch a football and to run and to ride their bike and to heal. And we know that we've accomplished that when we walk through our neighborhood parks and our regional parks, and we hear the laughter of children, and we hear community groups talking, and we see our elders walking along the path very slowly and being conscious about what they see and being in nature and, you know, seeing the birds and seeing the squirrels and other animals and being full of life. So our hope is that we will continue and that our work in this area will be fruitful in the area of creating these opportunities, this hopeful opportunities that everybody's welcome here and this place actually belongs to you.
Those are all beautiful sentiments, and I'm very happy to be able to end on those and thank our wonderful panel today. Sam, Maria, Nicholas, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. In the chat, we have an event survey. Folks could go ahead and fill that out and check out our briefs. They were, you know, a labor of love. And with that, go walk in the park today. Go enjoy yourself outdoors. Have a great day.